we're going to try and do this as a double act. So we're going to sort of take it in turns to go through. So Julie's going to kick off with talking about the site and some of the background to the work that we're doing.
Okay. Oh, when I move, I'm afraid Steve will disappear. Sorry about that. Right. Good evening, everybody. So, yeah. So Swandro, as oh no, it's not working. No, why won't it do, Steve? Try that. Ha. Yes. So I believe Peter's already told you something about Rousay and the amazing set of sites that run along this one coastline there. And some of them are very well-known sites like Midhowe and so on, the big Iron Age Broch site. But over about 10 years now, we've been looking at some of the smaller sites that are disappearing because of coastal erosion. And this, of course, is a problem, well, throughout the world, but certainly in places like Orkney and Shetland and a lot of the British Isles, it's becoming a huge problem because of climate change, because of the increased storminess that comes with climate change, and also rising sea levels. And these, for the most part, are little sites that just are not well considered, and there's not really any funding for them. And in the course of, we can't get the, right. In the course of looking at these sites, we came across one which was called Swandro. And I just realized we haven't, we can't get the laser pointer up, can we? You can see on the slide there, there's a Swandro is marked as the little orange dot, and just to the south of it is the cemetery of Westness, which is also quite famous. It's a Viking cemetery. And Swandro itself has some Norse houses that have been known about since probably the end of the 19th century. They're usually described as Viking, but they're actually a bit later. They're probably 11th to 12th century. And one of the reasons I was particularly interested in this site, because I've worked on a lot of Viking sites, is that Vikings tend not to find sites for themselves, we've realised in the work that we've done. They tend to generally go where there's already a settlement and already some evidence that there's you know, good land and good, in other words, they'd rather swipe somebody else's settlement than start out on their own. And so the fact that there was something there which appeared to be a later site, but there was also some indication of prehistoric settlement, was really interesting and looked like it might be another of these very early Viking sites that no one had known about before. As you can see, coastal erosion is a huge problem with Swandro. This is the site as we've covered it up for the winter, and we're just crossing our fingers and hoping it's still there, because obviously we haven't been able to get back and excavate again this year. Because it's such a big problem, and because funding sites like this is such a big problem, with the help of Casmanwell, we set up an archaeological trust to raise funds and to distribute the funds so that we could actually investigate this site. So there's a bit of a shameless plug there for the Swandro website, which if you look will tell you more about the site. There's our earlier reports and so on are on there. As I was saying, Westness, which is just to the south, is it's not exactly a unique site, but it is pretty unusual for the British Isles. There's a whole set of Viking graves there. This is one of them. You can see it's a boat shape. It's actually a boat grave with a warrior in it with a sword and shield and so on next to him. And that pin on the right-hand side is the Westness brooch, which is a silver gilt brooch, probably originally from Ireland or the Western Isles, probably from Ireland. And it's been appropriated by a Viking who was buried with it. There's a set of runes on the back giving the new owner's name. Modern work, isotope work on these burials, they were excavated in the 1970s, shows that at least 2 of these men had died of wounds, and they were also in origin from somewhere north of the Arctic Circle. So these are proper first generation Vikings. They were born north of the Arctic Circle, ended up buried on Rousay. So we knew, and under these Viking graves, there are actually Pictish graves, in other words, the graves of the original inhabitants of Rousay as well. But this is a site with proper, well-grown first generation Vikings who are the kind of people who would have been flooding into the Northern Isles in the 9th century. This is a fancy name for a topographic survey, I suppose you could say. It's a modern digital version of that. And if you look on this is the coastline around the Bay of Swandro. You can see on the right-hand side that orange blob right in the center of the curve there is the site of Swandro. And what this shows you is that it is elevated. It is a mound. It's known as the Knowe of Swandro, which is a term meaning a mound or a hill. These are a couple of pictures from the original excavations of the Norse houses there. Again, this site's not been published. The excavations from the 1970s haven't yet been published. It wasn't us, I have to say. But you can see the pathways between the houses there. There's 2 houses at least that we know of. And on the left-hand side, you can see someone standing up holding I don't know what it is, a ranging pole maybe. And just behind him, you can see a darker outline of a hummock. Well, that's the Knowe. That's the part of the site that we're excavating at the moment. One of the other indications that there were more Vikings around this area is this fragment of a sword that was dug up. It was actually ploughed up in the 19th century. And for a long time, it was assumed that the stupid locals had got it wrong, because it was said it was a sword from the hill of Swandro. And just recently we've realised, partly based on local evidence, that actually they got it right. This is not from Westness, from the Westness graves at all. This is from another grave that is somewhere around the Swandro site. And quite often when you get Viking settlement, you get this kind of founder burial, which is on its own. And I think that's probably a good candidate to be all that remains of that founder Viking burial. This is one of our drone photographs, and you can see it's probably easier to see on the right-hand picture. You can maybe just see in the area of lighter grass, 2 sets of parallel markings which almost run top to bottom of the picture. And those are the 2 Norse halls, the 2 Norse houses. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that we know now that they actually sit directly over Iron Age structures. And in fact, in the case of the one on the left-hand side, it's smashed through the top walls of the Iron Age structure. So there's no doubt that you know, this is in some way, it's not a different site at all. It's the same site. That's the last phase of the Swandro settlement. This is just a picture showing you the mound as it is today. This is from the landward side, so you can. It just gives you a little bit. It's a very difficult site to see on the ground because it's at the bottom of a slope and just by the beach. But if you can see that red and white ranging pole in the middle there, it gives you some idea of the height of this mound. We're talking about something which is, at least 3 or 4 meters in height today, and probably a lot taller. Well, when we get down to the foundations of this site, there'll be a lot more depth of material than that. So it is really quite a substantial site, and for something that we thought was a small, unregarded site to start with, it grows every year. And right, I think at that point I'm handing over to you, aren't I, Steve, for the next part?
Okay. The site is endangered. It's suffering from coastal erosion, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to look at this site, because it holds a huge amount of archaeological potential. And as Julie has said, it follows on from the research that we've done previously. And this big question of looking at these long cultural periods of occupation that we see on sites like Old Scatness, which is a village that spans the Iron Age, is centered on a Broch, and the settlement goes through into the Norse period and all the way through to the 20th century. The final abandonment of the mound was in the early part of the 20th century. So there we have a huge archaeological site that spans many generations. And the advantage of these sites is that we can actually look at cultural change and how things develop over time, and impacts of things like climate change and so on. So this site we suspected was a multi-period site, and that the Norse phase that we see with those log houses was just the last element of settlement on that particular site. And preliminary investigation of the beach demonstrated that we had earlier sequences underneath the boulder beach still surviving. And this was subject to investigations at the beginning of the program of work. And one of the things that we uncovered in that investigation of the beach deposits was this secular structure. It has a number of parallel walls. It looked very much like the casement walls of a Neolithic chamber cairn. And the thing that suggested that was that they were faced, it wasn't the same structure that one would expect to see with a Broch, with an inner face and an outer face. We were dealing with a series of outer faces. And we investigated that, and you can see the effects of coastal erosion taking away elements of the of this structure, and the effects of on the right hand side. You can see the effects of the sea and the damage that it's doing to the underlying archaeology. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to record as much as possible, as well as being able to excavate the archaeology there, and to be able to try and understand the archaeological sequence and the effects of coastal erosion. And to do that, we've been using 3D remote sensing technology, using laser scanners, for example. Here you can see the laser scanner on the left-hand side, and you can see the results that the scanned image presents on the right-hand side. The important thing about this is what we're recording is three-dimensional data incredibly accurately, and we're able to compare, because we've been excavating this site over almost 10 years. We're able to actually examine the rate of erosion. So not only are we understanding the archaeology, we're beginning to understand the erosion of the site. And this is a very different site, because to most coastal erosion sites, because it's under an active boulder beach. And here you can see one of the three images. So basically one can look at that data in different ways, rotate around it, and be able to sort of measure the differences between these different records. And the young lady who you saw with the instrument is just about to take up in the next few weeks a PhD looking at this data and other coastal erosion sites along this very vulnerable coastline. When we actually take the boulder beach away, we can see that the coastline itself, the underlying deposits underneath the beach, we have archaeology surviving quite well to some extent. What the sea has done is cut in, and we've got a series of steps or terraces that the sea has left behind. So at the top of the picture there is a lower terrace, then one comes up to an upper terrace, and so on. So one literally, as one comes up from the seaward side to the landward side, you're rising up a series of erosion terraces. So you're quite literally stepping through time. And the picture on the right-hand side just gives you a better idea of the sort of three-dimensional survival of the archaeology. The first structure that we identified was a building that was fragmented, that was cut by the sea. So we only actually have the very last elements of that building. And unfortunately, I don't think you can see,
Oh,
yes.
Ah.
Okay, can you see that red dot?
Yes, we can.
We can see it very clearly.
That's great, right. This is the building here. And basically what we have here is an entranceway coming through, and this is the last vestiges of that building, and it's been cut by the sea. So the sea has cut through, and we're looking at earlier deposits on this side. And this is that same stone, but looking at it, you can see what we have here is a series of upright stones here and a series of upright stones there. This is the erosion terrace. So this building's been truncated, and you can see this massive stone here. It's a big flagstone, some 2 meters in length. And if you look closely, you can see there's a slot there and a slot there that's been cut into that massive flag. And what we think we have here is a massive roundhouse that probably had a mezzanine floor. And these are the supports for the posts that would have held up that floor that ran around the circumference of the building. This is looking at that same erosion terrace. This is the underlying deposits. This is where the sea has truncated the archaeology, and we've at this stage gone down into the earlier deposits here. But the thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this feature here, which has a big hearth on the outside, and we've got a structure, a stone structure here. This is, believe it or not, an oven. And if we go to the next slide, this is the oven. We've got a parallel at the site of Old Scatness, which we will be referring to occasionally. And there we've got, again, a large hearth and this box-like structure providing an oven. And what we think we're dealing with here is some sort of specialized cooking activity. It's very different to the hearths that one sees in the center of many of these roundhouses. And we think there's something perhaps a little bit more specialized going on. And certainly the evidence that survived in this building at Old Scatness gave us several pointers to perhaps production of possibly fish oil and various other things. So that's nice to see a parallel to that. What's of interest that we concentrated on in 2019 is to look at these deposits here, because they were being eroded so badly by the sea. And I doubt if they survive, anything survives of these early levels at all now. And they were incredibly rich in material, environmental material that allowed us to look at the crops that were grown and the animal bone and fish bone, etc. And so we investigated those truncated remains. And here you can see this floor level within an earlier building here. You can see the remnants of the clay. So the rest of this building goes underneath our structure one. And what's interesting is the material that we're excavating here, because the pottery that we have here is early Iron Age in date. It's quite characteristic to the pottery that we see in Orkney. Is flat-rimmed, slightly splayed pottery. The rim there slightly splayed. And one of the closest parallels that we have with that sort of pottery is a site that we looked at in the 1980s. This is the site at Toft's Ness on the island of Sanday, another island in the Orkney group. Also, we've got this little seal tooth that's been made into an amulet. And just to the side of structure one, we have more material. Again, you can see it's been badly truncated, but here we've got the remains of a well, and you can see the well there with the steps going down. We're dealing with these terraces. So as I said, we've got literally steps in time. This is one of the upper terraces. And at this stage here, we see a building very different in architecture to the structure one, which is at the top of that picture. There's the well, and structure one is just beyond these upright stones at a slightly lower level. And what we have here is the remains of a Pictish building. And you can see we've got a paving, and we've got a division and a sort of entranceway coming through. And the sea, unfortunately, has just taken the edge of that building away. And if we look at that same building at a later stage of the excavation, we have an earlier floor that went underneath that entranceway. And you can clearly see how the sea has just taken away most of the archaeology there. And there's another view of that flagged floor and the proximity to the sea. What's interesting is underneath that flagged surface, we have earlier material, and we've got evidence of some metalworking here. And we've got this very large, nicely constructed tank. And what's interesting is that here we've got the remains of another oven-like feature, very similar to the one I showed you with structure one. This is the same building looking from the seaward side back to the landward side. So you can see the depth of stratigraphy that we have here. And this is the tank. And on that surface, we had a coin of Constance. So this is a 4th century coin, and from deposits that we excavated at the same level. Again, we've got quite a nice story with the radiocarbon dates here. Again, collaborating a date in the 4th century with radiocarbon dates. Structure one, which we looked at before, we've had dates from that which suggest that we're dealing with a 1st century BC, 1st century AD dates there. So with structure two, we're into the early part of what we would regard as perhaps the Pictish period. Structure three is another building that's just under this one is the Iron Age building that was truncated by the later Norse wall, and this is just the upper stages of the excavation. I put this in because if you note that stone here, we'll be looking at that stone later on. What we have just coming through here is the infill of that building, and we've got the long stone here, which is the back slab of a hearth. So this is the same building taken down with that infill taken out, and here you can see the position of the back slab, and here we've got the hearth itself within the building. But the key thing to note is how charcoal rich this surface is all the way around. And one entered the building is slightly subterranean, is cut into earlier material and revetted with a single face wall round here. And there's an entranceway coming through. There's a pivot stone here, so we know this is where the door was, and the door would open, so the door would have been across here and would have opened out that way. And you would have entered the building by coming down some steps into the corridor and into the building here. So this is the doorway coming across. That's the doorway here. So we're looking within this shot here into the corridor, and you can see these are the steps coming down into the building. Now, what's interesting is we've got the bar holes for the door, and the door could be locked either from the inside or from the outside, which is quite interesting. So there's two ways of being able to look at that structure. That stone I mentioned to keep in your mind is this one here, and the edge shows this pecking. And this particular stone has been used as an anvil, as has this one. And this made the press across the world, actually, because of these fingerprints. I don't know if you can see, we've got these carbon stains on the stone, and you can see the stains here and some more over on this side. Again, what we're dealing with here is another anvil. In fact, we have 3 anvils from this building, and it's associated with metalworking. And this is Dr. Jerry McDonnell, who is an archaeometallurgist, and he is using a portable XRF, X-ray fluorescence, to be able to analyze the floor surface. And one of the things that we did was to sample this and to be able to look at this building in great detail. And we've got both ironworking and copper alloy working here. And what Jerry is doing with this is trying to look at the intensity of traces of copper alloy on that particular floor surface. So you can see the various other samples, etc., that have been taken. Again, you can see here the dark nature of these floors. In fact, we have several layers to the hearth and several floor surfaces, and we're having a huge amount of metalworking material that's coming up from this in terms of mold fragments and slag and hammer scale from smithing, and crucibles as well. So we have quite a coherent story emerging from this building. And in terms of date, we thought in terms of the architecture, it looked very much like some of the Pictish buildings that we've excavated elsewhere. In fact, the building, we've got a whole series of radiocarbon dates now for this building, and it suggests that we've got a activity in the 1st century AD. and this is high status metalworking that's going on here. And what's interesting about the building is the use of space. And this is a model using that three-dimensional data from the laser scans. You can see the steps going in, and what's really interesting here is the use of space. So one would have come down into the building. The door jamb is across here. You can see the threshold stone that survives. This is where the bar would have been to lock the door. These are the two in situ hearths, anvils. This is the one with the fingerprints in, and there's a smaller square one here. This is that back slab. It was broken, so what we have here is just the stump of the back slab, and this is the hearth here. Now, with all the work that we did looking at the samples, we were able to give a very good story of what's happening. This is where the smith was working, in this area here. And the fire was maintained by somebody using bellows located at this side of the hearth. So the reason we can say that is not only the position of the anvils, but also the intensity of the copper alloy material that we have surviving here. And we have fragments from the tweer that protected the nozzle of the bellows, several fragments that come from this side of the building there. So we're beginning to get quite a coherent story about how space was used within that particular building. Underneath that floor surface, we have this rather strange wall, and you can see we haven't excavated for the, we've just taken a slot through the floor, but just to prove the stratigraphic relationships and to get some samples from this. But this wall goes underneath the wall of structure 3, and there's a parallel wall to it. And we think what we may have is an earlier ditch that is defending, protecting the early phase of settlement. And it's very similar to the ditch that we see surviving just perhaps half a mile down the coastline at the Broch site of Midhowe. And this is the presented remains. If you go to visit that site, you have the face of the ditch and rampart here. This is the other stone-lined face of the ditch on the other side. Now, we have, as I say, these series of terraces. This is another Pictish building. This is perhaps the latest building that we've investigated. Structure 1 is down here. Then we have a terrace, and this is much higher up. And what we have here is a fragment of a building. Most of it still survives on the landward side, but the sea has taken part of it away here. But we still have the floor surface surviving. And what's interesting about this particular building is the nature of this flagging, which is quite consistent across the floors. And we have what appears to be a hearth constructed into the wall. And this is a close-up of that hearth. And if we look at another parallel to that type of structure with a small building with flagged floor and a similar type of structure, this is a building from Old Scatness. What we have here is just the very base of this, This is a more intact example, and you can see all the carbon here. This is full of carbonized grain, and what we have here is a corn drying kiln for the processing of barley. And what's interesting, when we looked at this material here, again, this was full of barley, and there was a lot of barley on the deposits just overlying these flags as well. So what we think we have here is another threshing floor with these flags and a drying kiln next to it. The building that we looked at and we thought with these casement walls that we thought was an earthic chamber tomb, we were able to excavate. We managed to gain scheduled monument consent to be able to actually look at the landward side of that particular building, and you can see emerging on the landward side the inner wall of this structure, and we have an outer wall there. But if you look very closely, we have a series of phases to this, and instead of being a Neolithic chamber tomb, what we're dealing with is a roundhouse with great complexity that changes and is modified over time. We couldn't see that from the eroding beach deposits because literally we were left with just the foundations. But here we have the stratigraphy and the detail by being able to investigate the landward side where the preservation is much better. So what we have here is a roundhouse that is quite complex, and we were able to look in between the casement walls and to sample that and to look on the outside. Now, Julie's going to talk about the inside of the building, but just to give you a flavour, this is at the lower part, and again, the sea is taking so much of the archaeology away here, and we're dealing with most of the archaeology been taken away with redeposited beach material here. But you can see we've got a wall coming through which butts this secular wall coming around here. You can see a very clear joint that this is the original building coming through, with this being a secondary element. Now, what's interesting is that all this material is very disturbed by the sea, but underneath the wall we had some material that was sealed quite nicely by the wall itself. And if we look at the material from both in between the casement walls and from underneath that wall that's butting the roundhouse, we have a series of radiocarbon dates which give us an indication that the origins of that roundhouse are quite early, somewhere between 800 and 400 BC. So we're dealing with an early building that goes on for several centuries and changes over time and modified. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Julie, who's going to talk about the excavation within that building.
Okay, right. So as Steve was saying, this is a really, really complex building. It starts somewhere in the early Iron Age, like Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and then it kind of grows. Whether it's because it grows in significance, we don't know, but they seem to build these extra walls on it, make it look more and more significant, more monumental over time. And I'll show you some of that, but this is just to show you how scrappy the evidence closer to the sea is, and yet we can still get quite a lot of evidence from it. So you can see, maybe here's the present coastline, here's this gradual beach going down to the sea, and again we have these terraces, and on these terraces just these little scraps of floors and hearths. And Dr. Kathy Batt, who I think is listening in tonight, and spent a long time in 2018 sampling these floors archaeomagnetically. So we've got dates, archaeomagnetic as well as radiocarbon dates, to help us understand and unpick this incredibly complex sequence. Right at the bottom, in amongst all of these things, and under some of those sequences of floors, we had something which I still can't decide what it is. It might be another well, like the one further along the beach. There's certainly water in it now, and it is fresh water, but we know there are freshwater springs all along this coastline. But it's a slightly strange shape, and it might be a well, it might be some kind of corbelled cell from one of the earliest buildings on the site. We're really not sure yet, and that's something that we're hoping is still there and we can get back to and get to understand. So I'll go to something which is a little bit more obvious maybe, and that's where this last of these outer walls of this big roundhouse has been constructed. You can see here, and this beautiful passageway that runs through it and runs through actually all the other buildings along the beach here. So here's structure one that Steve showed you, the very first building we excavated with the big stone slab in one of the cells and the little oven next to it. And there's actually an entrance into structure one from this whole complex of little pathways here, steps and pathways and so on, that lead to this entrance going in into this big roundhouse. And the interesting thing is, on this side here, you can see a little building, a little cell constructed. And it's like the kind of guard cells that you get in Brochs, but instead of being in the Broch, well, because this isn't a Broch, this is too early, it's built on the outside. So it's a little building on the outside where, I don't know, where somebody greeted you or something else went on, so you could see what was happening on as you went in. And the other thing to note, just to give you an idea of scale, you see these two long stones here on the inside of the passageway. They're each over 2 meters, and they would have been orthostats, we think. They've fallen, and they don't look like they're anything to do with the roof. I think they were orthostats standing either side of this entrance. So as you went in along this beautifully paved passageway, as you came into the building itself, you had these two big stones that you walked through into the inside of the building. That side passage on the outside there, you can see here, and as it's just being excavated. And one of the things you can see are all these big slabs. Here's one of our American postgraduate students, Tom, and you can see the size of these slabs relative to him. And you can see here, these seem to have fallen from the wall of that roundhouse. And the way they've fallen, you can see it's very kind of single event and very high energy destruction. And there are more of them here in the part we haven't excavated. The whole of this area is full of these big slabs. It looks like deliberate destruction of that roundhouse at some point, and these stones have all fallen onto the roof of the little outer cell. The cell itself seems to have been blocked up before that. You can see here's a doorway going in, and you can see it's very neatly been blocked up, so the whole thing has been closed in. And to the extent that although the roof had been smashed in by all those big stones, the lintels for this doorway were still there. And you can see them here where we started to excavate. You can see that big cracked lintel there, which went across this doorway. It's a very small doorway. You'd have had to crouch to go into that building, whatever it was. And for a bit of scale, those of you who are old enough to remember the Time Team, this is our good friend Jackie McKinley here, who comes on holiday to dig with us every year that we're digging there. And you get some idea that's the kind of level of where the lintel was that she's standing in. Here's the cell with the doorway on this side here. This is a 3D model that perhaps gives you a better idea of how this building worked, with the corbelled cell where Jackie was on the outside there. This is the Pictish building that Steve was talking about with the corn dryer in it. So that's a later building imposed on the top of all of this. And then this doorway and passageway that runs into the roundhouse there. And again, just to give you an idea, it's a paved passageway, rather nicely paved passageway. So with beautifully constructed walls to it. So they put quite a lot of effort into making this look like a really monumental building. And one of the things when you go inside, when you're through here, through this passageway, there's those big orthostats that have collapsed, is that there is a, on this side, surviving one of the, I don't know what you call it, a room, an inner cell of this big roundhouse. There's a doorway here, which was later blocked off before these two big orthostats fell down. But you can make, it's a very oddly shaped building, room. You can see, here's the doorway, here you can see this thing. And again, it seems to have a very specific function, which we didn't quite realize when we first started to excavate it. There was lots of useful material, good material in there, lots of midden before we got to the floors. You get some idea of the depth of this building from the people digging in it there. And amongst that midden, some really interesting finds. This skull, these are all birds. Now I must admit, this is an articulated bird skeleton you can see here on one of the upper floors of that building. And there was another one in the passageway, and actually a third one next to a little pot. And they were all different sizes. And I must admit, I really did hope they were going to be ducks, because then we could say they'd had 3 ducks pinned to the wall. But unfortunately, they're not. This one here is the skull of a white-tailed eagle. You do sometimes get eagle bones on sites. They're fairly rare, but you know, we don't know why this midden included, as well as all the ordinary things, sheep and cattle and pigs and fish and so on, why there are bones of these, of something like an eagle in there. And these two, the white-tailed eagles have been extinct in Orkney up to the last couple of decades, I think. They're just starting to return to Hoy. But so obviously when in the Iron Age, they weren't that rare. These two bones, though, are even rarer today, because this is from something that's extinct. This is the beak and the lower jaw of a great auk. The last great auk died in the, I think it was the 18th century. In fact, it was probably the one that was shot on one of the islands of Orkney. They disappear from the archaeological record round about the Iron Age, the late Iron Age. They're large flightless birds. They look, they're related to penguins, and they don't exist anymore. But in the Iron Age, on Rousay, they seem to have plenty of them. This is also from a great auk. This is one of the wing bones, just to give you an idea of, obviously the wings are quite small because they're flightless. But these 3 bones illustrate something else. This is a sheep vertebra, and it's been chopped through with a very, very large, sharp blade. So these people, it's quite unusual at this stage in the Iron Age for people in these Northern Isles to have access to that kind of metal. And that just reflects back to what Steve was saying about the metalworking that's going on this site, the fact that they have you know, access to those kinds of materials. This one in the middle, same size pretty much as that sheep, is from a cod. This is fish. This is a fish vertebra from a very, very large cod, and that's really unusual. We don't see evidence for deep sea fishing much in the Iron Age, and we're still trying to work out why that might be. This is more like the kind of thing we find in the Northern Isles in the Iron Age. You see all these tiny, 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 tiny bones here. Probably somewhere in her living room, Cas Manuel is screaming because she and her partner, Dave Lawrence, have spent a very long time going through our soil samples, picking out these tiny bones. Think of sardines, something the size of sardines, really, and look at how many of those there are. So there are many, many, many fish bones on that floor. And again, it might be like Old Scatness. It might be something to do with processing for fish oils, but then why are the bones still there? Well, we can talk about that some other time. This is, again, is from that floor. It is, you might just be able to make out, it's actually a weaving comb. Most of the tines have gone, most of the teeth at this end have broken, or they're just worn down completely. It's made from antler. So they had also had access to a lot of antler on this site. And, you know, that island must have had a lot of red deer there in the Iron Age, and big ones as well, to have these kind of antlers available. This is the earliest floor surface in that structure, and it's intriguing in all kinds of ways. You can see there's a little private cell at the back here that you step into, guarded by these orthostats that would have been roofed over and have been a little back room of some kind. There's a hearth over here. There's another hearth here. You can see this big stone here. And this back stone to that hearth and the wall next to it were all covered in bright yellow clay. So again, that's something we tend not to think about with these stone buildings from the Iron Age, that they weren't this colour. They'd have probably had plastered walls plastered in yellow and white clay, which would have put a lot more light into the buildings than we necessarily understand. The other thing about that central passageway into that building was that after the whole thing had started to collapse, it was filled in. And it was filled in with some rubbish that brings us back to that idea that this site was a very, very early Viking settlement site as well. When the Vikings first appeared in the Northern Isles, this may have been one of the first places they settled. And the reason I say that is because in the top fill of this passageway, there was some very odd deposits. There was a whole series of cat skeletons, which had been butchered. And in amongst all this material, there was this tiny coin. This is a coin, it's about the size of my little fingernail. It's a coin of Enred, who is a fairly unremarkable, shall we say, Northumbrian king. You can see there E-A-N-R-E-D and the cross in the middle. And Enred, these coins are from about 810 to 850, so they're slap bang first half of the 9th century, the kind of time we would expect Vikings to be around and first appearing. And in fact, this Gareth Williams, who's the coin expert from the British Museum, says he can't imagine that this has got there from Picts trading with the Northumbrians or Northumbrians coming up to Orkney. Every coin of this kind that he's seen tends to be a Viking deposit. And Vikings, by the way, tended to use cats, butcher cats, for the skins. We have a lot of those from York and from other places. We know they did that. Just at the same kind of level as those deposits, which are over here in the passageway, is the top of another roundhouse that has collapsed and so on. And right in the top of the rubble of this roundhouse was a midden that didn't look like any of the other Iron Age middens we had. It had a lot of winkles and things in it, which just don't appear in the Iron Age middens. And in amongst that, there were two other finds that make us think that this is early Viking Age midden. One of them is this spindle whorl, which is made from a cattle femur. So it's that, if you think of the knobbly head of a femur, it's been sawn off and made into a spindle whorl. And this is a part of a needle case. You can see some decoration maybe at that end, which again tend to be Viking in date. So it looks like we have got the evidence for that earliest use of this site by Vikings, and that might even be who slighted the walls of this roundhouse, because that's certainly what happened at Old Scatness in Shetland when we excavated the site there. That may be all we ever see of the early Viking settlement of this site, because I suspect that most of it, if any of it survives, is on the landward side, where we're not digging because that's not the bit that's eroding. Some of the other finds from this building also tell us a lot about, as Steve was saying, the status of this site in the Iron Age, and the fact that early in the Iron Age, this is a high status site. The object you can see on the right here is another fragment of tuyere from that building I've just shown you. You can just about see that it's all been, what's the word I want, vitrified, but you can see the hole in the middle there, a fragment of it where the nozzle would go. This thing here, this little piece of antler, is one of the most intriguing ones, because what this is a cheek piece from horse harness. And you get this form of horse harness right the way through Europe. In fact, you see it in Egypt and in places like Syria as well, from the Bronze Age onwards, but Bronze Age and Iron Age in date. And you have to think this is on the island of Rousay, which is a few miles across and mostly consists of hill. But whoever was living at this site in the Iron Age was sufficiently high status that he had his horse and his horse harness. And that's quite unusual in the Northern Isles at that time. Hardly ever find horse bones, though there are some from Swandro. And I'll hand to Steve again.
Okay.
Oh gosh.
We've talked about the archaeology that's on the beach and the limited amount that we were allowed to excavate, because this is a protected monument. It's a scheduled monument. So we had to get permission, scheduled monument consent, to be able to excavate a small portion to make sense of the archaeology on the landward side. But we really need to be able to put the archaeology that we have from both of these contexts into perspective of the localized landscape, to be able to see and get a better understanding of what's there. And to enable us to do that, we managed to persuade my colleague, Professor Chris Gaffney, to come up into the early part of 2019 to carry out some geophysical survey of the mound, and one of the things that we were trying to do is to use various techniques, and most of you will have come across, perhaps with Time Team, the use of resistivity to be able to see under the ground, looking at moisture difference in the deposits underneath. And what Chris is doing here is using a technique that takes a number of different readings, so that one can actually look at the sighting plan at different depths. So basically, instead of having just two probes, there's a whole array of probes there which allow you to pass the current through, and in effect, one's seen near surface archaeology there, deeper archaeology there, and archaeology further lower down in the stratigraphic sequence there. So we're beginning to get an idea of what's happening. This is the area of the roundhouse, the excavation that we have open, and what we can see are things happening around that roundhouse, which coincide to the evidence that we've got on the beach. So this is the area that we've been investigating, and if we superimpose this on top, what we can see is that we have a whole series of buildings around that roundhouse. So that big roundhouse seems to be the focal point of an Iron Age settlement. This is the Norse buildings, those long walls that Julie mentioned at the beginning, that were excavated in the late 70s, early 80s. These are showing up quite nicely. So we're beginning to get an understanding of the archaeology immediately around the site. And this is that building underneath the midden. And this is one of those cellular walls. So if I go back, what we're seeing is one of these buildings. It's this one here. So what we have here is part of another large building, and this is our roundhouse. It's just at the top of the picture here. So we're getting an idea of the nature of the settlement, being able to put that site into context. And if we think in terms of the Iron Age settlement on Rousay, just along the coastline. I mentioned Midhowe Broch. This is the Broch at Midhowe, and this is the ditch that we were looking at. And what we seem to have is a nucleated settlement around that Broch tower. So I think what we have with the site at Swandro is something very, very different. Instead of having a Broch, we have this large roundhouse, which is added to and modified over time. This is the site at Old Scatness, which I referred you to with several of the buildings. And again, what we're dealing with here is a Broch. And again, this Broch has been modified over time. It has at least 3 major phases, and the last of which is in the pictures phase, because within the building is this cellular pictures building. And again, it's a nucleated village with settlement all the way around, and it's defended with a ditch, the same way as Midhowe. And if we think in terms of Swandro, again, we seem to have evidence of a ditch possibly showing up from the remains underneath the smithy building that we talked about earlier. We're also interested in being able to get an idea of the depth of archaeology using other methods. We tried radar. Radar wasn't that responsive, but another technique, again, using earth resistance in terms of looking at great transects across the site, and by passing, you can see these lines with all these cables coming through in. This is a technique which gives us a profile and being able to actually look at the depth. So what we have here is the archaeology that's near to the roundhouse, and what we have is quite a significant depth of archaeology. As one goes further inland, the archaeology begins to tail off until it becomes almost, it disappears almost entirely here. But one of the interesting things is this blue that you see here. What we seem to have is the water table. And that's quite interesting because of the wells that we've found. The well that was to the side of structure 1, and also possibly that strange cellular structure that Julie talked about within the large roundhouse. This is a magnetic survey that was done all the way. This is Midhowe Broch here. So this is a huge chunk of landscape from Westness all the way through to Midhowe, and this is North Howe, and there's a major settlement at North Howe. Swandro is here, and if we look at the data from Swandro, this is it blown up, and it shows the archaeology quite nicely in terms of the magnetic anomalies with all the burning and midden material that we have, those archaeological deposits here. What it's showing quite clearly is that there's some activity over here, but what we have is the last vestiges of this site. Once the sea has taken that away, that site is totally destroyed. So what we're dealing with is a finite resource. And if we look to the field to the north of the site, again, trying to put the archaeology into some context, I don't know whether you can see there, but there's a whole series of test pits going along in a transect across that field. So the site of Swandro, the Knowe of Swandro, is down here. So this is the field behind. And at one end, this is the plough soil. You can see there's very little depth in terms of soil there, in terms of stratigraphy. So this is just a modern day field soil with the bedrock coming through here. This is further along that transect, And what we found was the soils got deeper and deeper, and you can see the depth of soil here. And what's interesting is that this lower element of soil has a lot of carbon flecking and material within it. And what we appear to have is an anthropogenic soil, which has a lot of midden material or man-made ingredients that are going on as part of the manuring strategy in the Iron Age. So we have these deep soils that are associated with the settlement. So there's a lot of potential to understand the nature of the arable agriculture that's going on. So in terms of summarizing what we have here is that we've got an Iron Age settlement, a village that's around this large, impressive roundhouse, which is quite early in date. It doesn't appear to be a Broch, but it does appear to be monumental and a focus of an important site. And this site has a longevity. Certainly in terms of the Iron Age, and we're dealing with a long Iron Age here if we count the Pictish period, because we don't have the Roman period. So the late Iron Age or Pictish period is immediately pre-Viking. So we have 1,000 years of settlement going through. And what we appear to have is evidence. We certainly know there's Norse elements to the site from the landward side, and the material that we've excavated strongly suggests at the moment that we're dealing with first generation Viking settlement on the site. And Scatness was quite interesting in that the Broch Tower was still standing when the Vikings arrived, and quite clearly they've used some of the Iron Age buildings and they demolished the Broch. The actual demolished layers of stone for the Broch date to the arrival of the Norse and the way they changed the site. So the question is, are we seeing all this structured, deliberate modification as part of that same arrival event at Swandro? We can't say at the moment. We need to have more work on that to be able to see what's happening. But certainly what we're dealing with is the last vestiges of a much larger settlement that's been taken away by the sea. But it's extremely interesting because it's high status. We have all this complexity in terms of metalworking. The animal bone and the butchery evidence indicates that we're dealing with feasting and other high status activities that are going on there. And we've also got other high status material, which I haven't got photographs of, so I can't show you, but we've got several pieces of Roman glass, again dating to the 1st century, that came more or less next to that weaving comb, so in the same layers of that floor of that building. So it's work in progress. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has rather upset things, and we just hope that the sea has left something of what was once a really major settlement, and quite an important settlement, and so different to the other Iron Age sites that we see in Orkney and Shetland. So it's telling a very different story to what we've seen with sites like Midhowe that was excavated in the 30s, and sites like Old Scatness, which we excavated in the late 90s and early 2000s. So that's where I'd like to leave it.
Well, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I'm not sure whether people can unmute and clap, or whether we go to the reactions and sort of use that to clap. But no, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating. I can see why Peter likes spending time up there. And I'm glad I don't have to clean the stones. Oh God, that made me. Ah.
There are a lot of stones.
Okay. Questions. Well, I forgot to mention the chat. A couple of people have added questions to the chat. Oops, sorry, yes, I did. I forgot. Peter was actually first up. So Peter, would you like to unmute and...
Yes, I'm unmuted. Hope you can all hear me, can you?
Yes, well, I can.
Oh, well, first of all, may I congratulate you on the graphics of the first century smithy. I thought that was absolutely marvelous, the way you illustrated it in dimensions. But the question I suppose I have is, of course, that a smithy like that would be made of stone in the Orkneys because there aren't any trees, but presumably down south would have been made of wood. So does it mean that, in fact, a first century smithy like that is quite unique? I mean, you wouldn't be able to find anything comparable further south.
Yes, I mean, it is unique. I think it's unique in several ways. One is unique in terms of, I mean, the archaeology of the Northern Isles. We're dealing with three-dimensional archaeology because we're dealing with stone buildings and the depth of stratigraphy. It's more like an urban site than many of the rural sites that we would have, say in Wessex or anywhere in the south, where one's dealing perhaps with landscapes that have been really extensively used over time, and one's just, if one's lucky, just has post holes or ditches and so on. So here we've got the depth of material and the infilling, and we've seen really good preservations of floors. So that's enabled us to do the detailed scientific work that perhaps one couldn't do easily on another site. This is the first site, I think, of this type of quality in terms of archaeological remains that has been excavated. I mean, Jerry McDonnell has been working on archaeological sites up in Orkney and Shetland for most of his lifetime, and he's written up and looked at the archaeometallurgy for all the major excavations that are of recent years, sites such as Howe, for example. It's a very interesting narrative that we're getting from the combination of the scientific work that he's been able to put in and the quality of the archaeology and survival that we're seeing there. And it's given us, I think, a very much a new understanding and the importance of metalwork in the Iron Age.
We honestly did think when we first saw that building that it was Pictish, because the semi-subterranean nature of it and so on, but also because of the quality of the kind of metalworking that was going on in there, because there was what's it called, the fire welding. Jerry said that they were using fire welding to produce really high quality blades, and we know that from the kind of slag that was turning up all over the floors, and that's certainly not something I'd have expected to see in a first century AD building. But it is probably the source of a lot of the wealth and a lot of the power of these Iron Age sites in Orkney and Shetland. I think that they have access to this kind of material and this kind of technology.
And I think the other thing is the trade and the contact that one thinks of Orkney as being quite isolated today, but in terms of the Roman finds and the quality of the metalworking and so on, I think the amount of contact And we certainly saw this with Old Scatness as well. Again, we were getting Roman material within the deposits there. And even in the Pictish deposits, we had contact with, we had some Anglo-Saxon material, Ipswich ware pottery, that was found in one of the, in fact, it was that cellular building in the center of the Broch. So I think we underestimate the amount of contact that there was in the past, and the location of this site on that Westness coastline. That is an arterial routeway through Orkney. We see a series of Iron Age sites on both sides of the sound, both on Rousay and from along the coastline. Gurness is a large Broch village, if you like, very similar to Scatness on the other side. And there's a whole series of Broch sites going along that coastline. So in the past, geographically, that would have been a really important routeway going through the heart of Orkney. And I think these issues of contact and trade are quite interesting. And I think the environmental material that we're getting, again, is very, very different, isn't it, to what we expected in terms of, the evidence for butchery and so on is very different.
It's more like the kind of thing we had at Scatness with a high status Broch than we expected from something which is earlier and not a Broch. So yeah, I mean, it just goes to show that there are, even something like the Iron Age, we don't understand as well as we thought we did. That there are different levels of sites and different kinds of sites than we thought were around in the Iron Age in the Northern Isles, I think.
And it also, I think, highlights the importance of actually investigating some of these eroding sites, because they do contain a huge amount of information, and they're disappearing with climate change, rising sea levels, and storminess, changing climatic conditions. That it's a vanishing resource that once it goes, it's going to be gone forever.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes. Push on with one or two of the other questions that have come up, because I think some of them will refer back to what you've just been saying. But Ingrid Holland, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was very intrigued from the beginning. I thought I heard you say that the Viking skeleton came from north of the Arctic Circle, which is what I do as well.
Yes, that's true.
Was that based on isotopes, or do you have DNA from it?
I don't think there is. No, that recent DNA study didn't involve the Westness skeletons, but there is. It's from isotope work. From, I can't now remember the reference, but it was Janet Montgomery at Durham, who is an old friend and colleague of ours, who did the isotope work on them. And they looked at some of the Pictish skeletons, the burials under the Viking ones, and they were all very definitely Orkney. They were all native, as it were. And they looked at 3 of the Viking skeletons. The 2 male burials, there's 2 male boat burials, and 1 of the female burials. And the 2 men were both, one of them was north of the Arctic Circle, the other one was also very far north, I think, but maybe not quite that far north. So they were both definitely first generation. They did not come from Orkney. The woman was intriguing because she came from either the Western Isles or Ireland, but again, not from Orkney. So, you know, they really are first generation settlers in that cemetery.
It would be very interesting to have the DNA from them as well.
It would, yes. But I know they weren't in that study, and I'm not sure why. But yes, it would, absolutely.
Just to interject, if the woman was possibly from Ireland, would that perhaps also account for why there was some of the possibly Irish material found in the grave?
Yes, that brooch was not from. I don't think that was the same woman. That could, because the Westness brooch came from the first burial that was found, didn't it?
Yeah, much earlier.
Yeah, the first burial was found when the farmer sent 2 men out to dig a hole to bury a cow out on the Westness Peninsula, and in digging the hole to bury the cow, they found this grave of a woman, and with the Westness brooch, and so I think the local archaeologists came out, and this was back in the 1950s, 1960s, I think. So someone came out and excavated the burial, and then they buried the cow, and then the National Museum of Scotland decided they wanted to have another closer look at the burial, so someone else had to go out and unbury the cow a few weeks later. And that person apparently still held a grudge that the person who'd originally found the Westness brooch got paid for it, and he had to go out and unbury the really smelly cow, and he didn't get anything for that. So anyway, that's an aside, but so I think that was a different one, but it does suggest that yes, you've got this intermingling, and of course, as Steve was saying, because that's the main route way into Orkney from the west side of Orkney and coming up the west side of Britain. It's also the route from Ireland and from the Isle of Man and the Western Isles into Orkney. So yeah, it's a lot of intriguing thoughts around that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Next, well, sorry, Ingjerd, have you any?
No, I'll leave it for now. There are so many questions still.
Andrew, I'm not sure whether the whiskey is a request from us or not, but would you like to ask your question? Perhaps he's basically Andrew Selkirk was asking, presumably, did they ferment alcohol there and perhaps distill it into some form of spirit? What was the climate like, and was the Roundhouse a mini broch?
Hello, are you hearing me now?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes.
Right, we can hear you. Would you like to ask your question, please, Andrew?
Was really a comment that Rousay is surely a whiskey island. Grant's Highland whiskey is still there. And in the 1920s and 30s, Gordon Child loved his whiskey and went up and did a lot of classical Neolithic excavations in Rousay in a haze of whiskey, or so I've been told. Did you get hold of any of this whiskey? My second question really is about climate. What was the climate like there at that time? Did you get any environmental evidence for it? One always gets the impression that the Roman period was a warmer period than it is today, and that is why you get this rather very rich culture in Orkney and Shetland because it was so warm. And really my third question is Roundhouse. Why not a broch, or rather a mini broch? Surely it looks very like, it has very broch-like appearances. And perhaps one might add a fourth thing, those Vikings, surely they were invaders. We are seeing here evidence for the Viking destruction, the sheer Viking destruction that they wreaked here when they arrived. They just destroyed everything.
Oh gosh, right, where are we going to start? Calendar and Grant, yes, did lots of excavations on Rousay.
And
with Child, yes.
Child,
Child, rather.
with Rynio,
yes.
yeah.
yes, that's true. And no, there isn't a Rousay whiskey today, but there are two very good Orkney ones.
Mm.
So, so yeah, we've tried those. Yes.
And the Rousay, little Rousay shop somehow buys Highland Park, which is the local Acadian whiskey, is probably the cheapest place I've ever seen it on, for sale in Orkney. So if anybody does a day trip to Rousay, calling into Marion's shop is a good idea. Is a good idea. Yes. For the local economy.
Climate. Yes, you're right. It's something I've been looking at over the years, is to try to find some good evidence for what the climate was exactly in that area of Orkney and Shetland in the Iron Age. But from the archaeobotanical evidence, from the plant remains, the cereals and so on, they are really good quality cereals, and we get a lot of it. And Steve was talking about the anthropogenic soils, and they knew how to farm in that environment very, very well. And I suspect you're right. I suspect it was a better climate, and that they knew how to manage it, and they did produce very large cereal crops, I think, which are part of what made these settlements so successful. And what's really interesting is when we were working at Scatness, and also had evidence for these, really, as Steve was showing you, they had grain drying areas. They had enough grain that they would use in kilns and so on. And interestingly, in Shetland, we had a lot of resistance from local historians and local people who said it could never have been that good, because of course their folk history goes back 100, 200 years into the end of the Little Ice Age, and really quite miserable climate. And so they didn't believe that Orkney or Shetland could ever be that productive agriculturally, and yet obviously it was. And then what did we have after that? There was Viking, something in between.
Why was your roundhouse not a broch?
That's your question, Steve.
When we first uncovered the first of the outer walls, my first thought after excavating the Broch at Scatness, I thought, we've got a Broch, and I was very excited. And then we saw these casement walls on the beach side. Most of we were just left with the last residues of walling there, and it didn't quite fit. We've been looking quite hard at this building, and I think probably what we're dealing with is a complex roundhouse. I think it's an early precursor to a Broch, very similar to the site at Boo that John Hedges excavated outside of Stromness in the 1970s, and perhaps the early phase of Howe as well. But instead of the architecture that we've seen so far doesn't provide us with the sort of classic Broch architecture. I think what we've got is a hybrid building that's added to it. It still is a monumental building, but it's not a classic Broch as it stands. So we've been really cautious about not saying the Broch word too much. We last 2019 we had Neil Sharples, who you probably know well, Andrew, jumping up and down on the site saying it's a Broch, it's a Broch. But we had a very strong debate about the archaeology, but I think we remain a little cautious because I think it's really important, because it is such an early date that we're getting with some of those early samples on the coastal side. And I think what's intriguing is Old Scatness was pushed the dates of Brochs back several centuries with the scientific work that we were able to do with Dr. Kathy Batt. And I think what we're dealing with here is really interesting, because I think we're seeing the yet an early site. And what's intriguing is it continues in terms of importance, certainly for a number of generations. So I'm just hoping that we've got enough of the material left that we can go back to it and to do more, to gain a better understanding of it.
And the Vikings, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It goes backwards and forwards whether Vikings are nicely farmers or whether they're destroyers. Or I think they were the people who they used these. They used these sites. They didn't use the sites in the way that the people who had been living there up to that point used them, which suggests that they were not. They had no interest in
settling
or negotiation. Let's say. I mean, they settled. Obviously, they settled, but they used the site in a different way after that. But they had enough nous to look at these sites and realise that that they must have been hugely attractive. These were good agricultural sites, wealthy sites with access to materials such as iron and copper and lead. We know from the material we've got, and they must have been hugely enticing to somebody looking for somewhere to settle, who who had the ability to take them over.
And they're very productive in terms of agriculture. As well with the field systems. I mean, it's something that I've been looking at for most of my archaeological life is looking at field systems. I looked at a multi-period landscape, prehistoric landscape at Westness on the island of Sanday, and one of the things that we saw there was a sequence from the Neolithic all the way through to the early Iron Age of buried soils. These were soils that had been covered by windblown sand. So we had pristine arable soils, and we have evidence there for manuring strategies and so on. And we saw the same thing at Scatness, and we also looked at some of the early soil sequences that Gordon Chard looked at Jarlshof as well, and we excavated those sequences next to his early excavations on that corner of Jarlshof, where the early deposits are there. And what we seem to have is intensive manuring, an infield type of agriculture. And what's we see change, but a continuity of that practice in a way from the Neolithic all the way through to the Iron Age, and through to the Pictish period, the late Iron Age. But when the Vikings arrive, certainly at Old Scatness, they have no understanding that they have productive fields, but that manuring strategy is lost.
Yeah.
So there isn't a continuity that goes through there, and we see very different practices coming through. The fishing practices at Scatness quite clearly. There's a complete package that comes in, and is so different from the Iron Age. So, I mean, the model that we're working on is that the Vikings within the Northern Isles are cherry picking existing rich farms or estates and taking those over. The big question is what happens to the native population. Are they assimilated, or are they taken off as slaves? Are they perhaps taken off to Iceland?
Could I just interject a little quick question related to this, but also to the next one that Chris Seymour is going to ask, and that is, what does the pollen analysis tell you about the amount of tree cover that there still was and varies from the Iron Age, if you like, up to the Vikings, and also, if you like, the any changes in the agricultural practice?
Oh, we don't have. There was some pollen work on Rousay on some Bronze Age deposits in the next bay, but we don't have any for around that area. We don't have the right kind. I have ambitions to get somebody to core in the loch, in the little loch and next to the site, but we haven't managed to get anyone to do that yet. So I don't have pollen evidence, sadly.
I mean, Kevin Edwards looked at the
Yeah, he
bay
did. Yeah.
beyond, but it was earlier.
So in that case, sorry to, but I just realised a number of people want to ask questions, and there's not much time. The timber then that would have been used, for instance, for metalworking, etc. If you've got this extensive sort of forge and metalworking, was that beech driftwood or cut or imported?
I can't tell you from Swandro yet, because we haven't looked at that material yet
No,
but
the frustrating thing is we've been divorced. We're both shielded, so we haven't been near the archive material since March.
But from work I did on an island called Sandy in Orkney some years ago, and the work at Old Scatness is quite intriguing, because on Sandy we had a lot of willow charcoal, and it looked like certainly in the late Iron Age, the Pictish period, they were basically managing willow stands on the island, and the same at Old Scatness as well. So I would assume that some of the fuel would be willow, young willow, and a little bit of hazel. You do get little patches, even in Shetland, of that kind of vegetation, even today. One of the other things we found in one of the hearths at Old Scatness in the Viking period, interestingly, was a whole load of chips of oak. And whether this was reuse of old boat timbers or something like that, I don't know. But it was not something you'd have expected to find in Shetland. And certainly didn't come from Shetland either.
Okay, well, could go on a long time with that. So, but if I could just press on with some of the questions people have asked. Chris?
Yeah, any thoughts on where the sort of raw materials, the metal for the metalworking actually came from?
The Rousay is quite minerally rich, and there's actually copper available on the island, on that side of the island.
And lead. There's lead. There's historical evidence of an old lead mine on Rousay as well. So they had both copper and lead there. And they also, there's a lot of iron ore around in Orkney as well. So yes, they had the raw materials.
But they were actually importing material, and one of the things that Jerry looked at was the copper alloy material, and he's gone through all the crucibles, all the molds, and as well as some of the other material, and it's quite an odd combination of the alloy, and I can't tell you the exact combination off the top of my head, but the one thing that ties in quite nicely is that it's the sort of alloy that one would see in the Roman period. So again, you know, with the material that we're getting with the Roman glass, etc., it's quite again suggests that there's contact with the outside world, that we should be viewing this not as a remote, isolated community, but it is a community with trade links to the greater world at that time.
Is that okay, Chris? Okay, Robert, would you like to ask your question? Okay, on his behalf then, Robert asked, are some of the passages as narrow as they look, or is this just an optical illusion?
They're not that narrow, actually. What would you say? About a metre or a metre and a bit across?
Well, some of the passages are quite narrow.
But not the main one into the... Sorry,
not the main one.
That's our cat who's getting hungry and keeps tapping both of us on our back. Yeah, some of them are, and obviously that little guard cell or whatever had a very low doorway into it.
Yeah.
So it was more of a crawlway than anything. But no, I think some of it's optical illusion. What's the diameter? It's about 30 meters diameter, the site, isn't it? The roundhouse. So so it's quite a big building. So it does make the passages look small.
Right, if I could ask Yvonne to chip in with her question. I know it's not quite in sequence. Yvonne? Because Yvonne was asking, could the very small outbuildings be for dogs?
It's possible, but I mean, there's been suggestions in the past that some of the cells one sees in the Broch
and so on might have been for dogs.
Yes.
Guard dogs, yeah. Interestingly, I don't think we've got any dog bones, actually.
Oh, I was just going to ask that. Have you got much dog material?
But we do have gnawing on some of the bones, so there must have been dogs. But dogs are one of those things that they tend to be deposited differently. You know, they don't just get chucked in the general midden quite often. So that might be why we haven't got them. But no, it's quite possible, yeah.
And the gnawing marks were definitely canine, not bovine.
Yes, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Are you getting gnawed,
I'm
Steve?
just getting cat gnaws.
Right. Okay, very quickly. Bernadette, you had a couple of quick questions, I hope.
Yeah, I was just wondering why they were actually extending and altering the existing buildings rather than starting to build a new building, which would have reflected their way of living rather than an earlier way of living.
That's really interesting, and I think it must be that building had a significance. I don't know what you think, Steve. That it had a significance, and they were kind of intent on glorifying the building that was there rather than starting again.
Right. One of the things that I think we're seeing is
excuse me,
these sites are quite focal, and the Brochs that we see, such as Scatness and Old Scatness, Jarlshof, they're long-lived buildings that go through modifications, and they're substantial structures. They're monumental in many ways, and great, impressive buildings. And I suppose if one looks at buildings today that are important structures, many of them have a history that goes back in time. So I wonder if it's the importance it's an inherited an inheritance, if you like, going back. So
it has an importance beyond being just a house.
Yes, yeah. It's a place. It's a symbol of who we are, where we came from. So, yeah.
Yeah. Alison, I think this is the last formal question. Alison.
Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting everything, but also the evidence of coastal erosion. And Steve, you mentioned there being terracing. Is that because there would be a periodic big storm that would swipe out a particular layer of occupation, or is there some other process going on that causes the terracing? Please.
Yes, what we're seeing is, I think, quite a complicated picture. And one of the things that has intrigued us has been trying to understand the effects of coastal erosion, because this type of site hasn't really been looked at in the past.
Well, no one thought anything survived under boulder beaches, basically.
Yeah, I mean, most sites, a lot of sites like Poole, for example, on Sanday, that was excavated in the 1980s, and we looked at South Howe on Rousay, just next to Midhowe, and we also looked at a Viking site, a coastal erosion site in the Faroes, an early site there, and basically they're all cliff exposures.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is quite unusual to be able to have archaeological deposits surviving under the beach layers. And what's happening is those storm surges that you talk about coming in and taking material away. It's slightly more complicated, I think, because it's the nature of the archaeology that protects. So we see a certain amount of that big roundhouse has actually sheltered some of the archaeology, but further as you go further along the coastline, away from the Knowe of Swandro, towards those Viking buildings, the seas more or less come straight up.
It's cut in
and cut in, so you've almost got almost like a vertical face there. But nearer to the Knowe and the roundhouse, there's these terraces surviving, and one of the things that's protected and formed those terraces is the nature of the archaeology. Because, for example, structure 1, you've got these large flagstones and they're bedded into clay, so you have a resistance layer, if you like. So we're seeing this sort of combination effect. The other thing that we're seeing, and we really didn't predict at all, was the wave action that occurs with every tide. As the tide comes in, there's a lot of pressure, and it seeps into the softer archaeological deposits. And when the tide goes out, a certain amount of material is put into suspension and comes out. So, for example, when we were excavating the smithy building, when we were going into those deep deposits, we actually found a small piece of plastic that had been, which was driven in underneath all the archaeology. There was shell sand and this piece of plastic.
And then that smithy on top of it.
No, underneath it.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, the whole of the smithy building and all its deposits was perfectly protected, but some of the lower layers had been completely
taken away by the tide coming in and the water pressure coming in, and putting material into suspension and taking it out, and high energy events pushing in material like the beach sand and this small piece of plastic.
Look, the time is pushing on, and you've been overly generous with both your talk and with answering the questions. Could I just ask if anyone has a particular question that they really would like to put now? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No, if not, well, look, Well, Peter, you better finish off because, well, no, I will say thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating talk. The fact that you've held so many people for twice our normal length of time.
Okay, sorry about that.
And they obviously strangled their own cats. As they weren't disturbed. No, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure hearing and fascinating, and it's really, I think, explained why Peter was is so fascinated by working up there. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay,
Thank you. Oh dear.
Sorry, Peter, do you want to say anything quickly?
No, if I could just add, thank you very much. It was fascinating. Even as someone who's obviously been there, I learned so much. And I particularly thought some of your graphics and visualizations were extremely useful and well done. So well done indeed, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry, okay. It was a bit fuller than we thought.
We'll just have to have you back again. Anyway, look, thank you very much indeed. And could I thank the Razzers, well, for both listening, but also for asking interesting questions. I would certainly like to go on for longer. I have a whole list of them here, but I think that really should wait. And so people can go off and feed the moggy or whatever. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to having people next February. Just to remind you that this was an extra. We don't normally do a talk like this in January, so this is yet another advantage. If you are grabbing at straws for conditions in the country.